In this video, I'll add depth of field to my composite. I want to get the layers blended and composited first, before I work on post effects like depth of field, blur, or color correction. Once I've got the layers in, I want to add my 3D and blur effects first, then the things that deal with color like color correction, and finally color dependent effects like glow. These images are IFFs out of Maya, and they have Z-depth attached. I'll browse over to the project directory, pressing Window key E to pull up my Explorer, and going to Projects, First Robotics, Maya. In the Images directory, I have all of my sequences here. I'll pull open the first one of Scene 1, Shot 1, the Beauty Pass, double-clicking it and loading it up in F-check. Looks fairly dim because we're looking outside. It's got RGB data, alpha data, and Z-depth because we set it up in the rendering. Z-depth then is a grayscale image recording depth from the camera as a negative number. White is close and black is far. I'll extract this and bring in that image sequence into Composite for use to drive a blur. What I'll do in F-check is choose File, Open Animation. I'll browse over to my Beauty Pass and select the first one. With the first image selected, I'll check Z-buffer to make sure it loads, and click Open. It loads in the animation in F-check, which is a very handy utility player that ships with Maya. I'll click on the Z button and split out that Z-depth. Let it cycle through once, and now choose File, Save Animation. What we're doing here is displaying metadata, the Z-buffer, in the RGB viewer, and then saving it as an RGB image. Under Save as Type, I'll make these targas, and for the file name, I'll put in Scene 1, Shot 1, Z, and hit Save. I can do this from either the beauty or the occlusion image. It doesn't matter which because they both have the same Z-depth. Our import out of 3ds Max is different. We'll run out OpenEXRs and show the Z-depth in Composite. I've closed F-check, and I'm in my working file, ready to import the new footage. I'll press Ctrl-I and import in my Z-depth. Here in the images, there's the targa sequence. I'll click Import, and then close the Import dialog. With my Z-depth selected, I'll select the connection of the blend and comp to the output, or I can create the depth of field separately and connect it in manually. I'll click with the mouse wheel and choose Tools. And under the Tools menu, in Filtering, I'll pick Lens Blur, and I'm going to drag it right onto that connection line. It makes the connections for me. Now I'll plug the Z-depth in, clicking and dragging from the output of the Z-depth image node over to the modulation image on the lens blur. What we've got here, as I pull this down so you can see it, is the blend and comp goes into the lens blur in the foreground, or the input image. The Z-depth goes into the modulation, saying how are we driving that blur? Right now, nothing's really happening. I'll click on the lens blur and go to the modulation tab. What this lets me do is, based on the Luma channel of the modulation image, click a node that's in focus. I'll scroll over on the timeline to the end and add the focus on the echo, clicking on the eyedropper and picking one of them. Then I'll increase the X and Y radius by clicking and dragging in the field. I start to get a little bit of blur in the background and the foreground. The trick with blur is don't be excessive. There's lots of imagery out there with bokeh blurs and excessive blurs, and everything is just smeared. My advice, don't do that. Unless somebody says we need an extreme depth of field, keep your blur subtle. Now, here's a variation if it's not looking right. You could invert the Z-depth color and see if that helps a little better. If I crank up my radius pretty decently and I'm not seeing enough blur, I may want to do that. But this looks pretty good because I'm blurring out those window frames pretty heavily. I'll pull it back down, maybe to about 5 or 6, and see how it looks. I'll scrub along the timeline and see if I need to adjust anywhere. One of the neat things is we can animate almost anything. Here's what I'll do to animate this. I'm going to right-click on the offset and set a keyframe at frame 1. Then I'll adjust that luma and pick the rocks, blurring out some foreground, and I can also key the radius in the same way. I'll scrub over to maybe the next focal point and see if I need to change. I can repick that focal point, bring the column in focus, and set another keyframe. I can also use auto key like 3ds Max. Either way works. Now I'll come over to the last frame and key it one more time on the eco and set the keyframe. My depth of field is now keyed. If I need to play with the animation tangents, I can go to the Animation tab, and it functions just like the graph editor. In the graph editor, we can adjust the tangents as needed. I'm going to leave mine slow in, slow out, so it's nice and smooth. We're ready to add the next pieces, color correction and glow. We want to think about, as part of our composition, what's in focus and what's out of focus. Remember that in CG, things just get smaller in the view, but they stay optically perfect. It's only until we blur the image does it look really, well, right.